Hello and welcome to UKAuthority Live with me, Helen Olsen-Bedford. Today we're going to be talking about GDPR and subject access requests. As 25th of May draws ever closer, what does the new General Data Protection Regulation mean for our health and local public services? In particular, are organisations ready for subject access requests? And what impact will the ICO's imminent citizen awareness campaign have on the volume of such requests? Joining me today in the studio to discuss these core questions are Dawn Monaghan, who's Head of Data Sharing and Privacy at NHS England, Head of Strategic IG for NHS Digital, and Director of the Information Governance Alliance, so an expert on data. I have Gurpreet Dutt, who is Head of Programme and Projects at the Midlands and Lancashire CSU NHS, and Darren Bassett, who's Head of Business Transformation at TISCI. Thank you for joining me. Now, as ever, please, audience, do join in. Use the chat facility to put through questions to me. And please remember to put your name and where you're from to those questions. Thank you. So let's just start at the beginning here. Where are we in terms of final guidance from the ICO, bearing in mind that 25th of May is not far away? Dawn?
Well, we've got to be minded about final guidance. So guidance is coming out in dribs and drabs. The ICO can't provide their definitive guidance until the Article 29 Working Party, the group that sits there of all the supervisory authorities around Europe, so the ICO from each European country, come out with their interpretation and their guidance. Then the ICO can turn that into domestic guidance and put that out. So it is taking time, it's dribbing and drabbing through from Article 29, and therefore the ICO then is giving its guidance. And the National Working Group for Health and Social Care is also providing some guidance. So there are a few new bits of guidance come out this week about consent and lawful processing. But we've got to be minded that we won't get a whole suite of guidance by the 25th of May that will cover every article and every piece of good practice that we're supposed to be doing. We've had a Data Protection Act now since 1984. There are still arguments going out about what the interpretation of certain sections of that Act are, and there's still amended guidance coming out, which, takes on board interpretation of the law and policy decisions as they're going along. So, you won't get a full suite of final guidance by the 25th of May. You will get an inkling of the guidance and it will start to develop, and probably you won't have a full suite ever, but you'll, within a 12-month to 2-year period, you'll have a good idea.
So in the meantime, on the basis that this is almost like it appears to be an evolution of data protection, what does that mean for, the number of press releases that I'm getting weekly from people saying, oh, it's like the Y2K, the Millennium Bug, it's all going to implode on the 25th of May and your data's going to be a disaster and you're all going to get fined, etc. Is that true or not?
I don't think it is. I don't think it's true. I think it'll be something that we will take in our stride, and it certainly won't have it doesn't come with the euphoria that the Y2K bug did come with. But obviously there is important guidance coming out that we need to interpret and trying to implement before, sometime, during the summer. So there isn't a deadline as such, but we need to start thinking about how we're going to be managing those requests and how our organisations are going to be complying with those going forward.
Do you think that some of the suppliers are being a bit irresponsible here, perhaps, in terms of saying it's like Y2K? As a supplier, what do you think on that?
Potentially. I mean, I think there's almost an expectation that there's going to be this big bang and someone will unveil all the guidance in advance of the 25th of May, 2018. World's not really like that, is it? I mean, businesses are going to continue to evolve, digital services continue to evolve, and the way that we work will continue to evolve. Therefore, the data we collect, the data we use, the data we store, and the reason for using it will change. So unless there's any businesses out there that are just not going to move forward after 25th of May, then they will need to continue to evolve their processes, their ways of working, and what they do in terms of responding to GDPR. There is an awful lot of guidance that's out there already that people can use. 12 steps to compliance is incredibly useful. Yes, it's high level, but actually it enables people to be informed, become aware, and actually start preparing for GDPR.
So nobody's going to get fined on the 25th of May for not dotting every T and crossing every I on the
No, or the 26th of May. No.
No, 26th of May, of course. Well, yes. Would it be the day after, wouldn't it? You give them 24 hours grace.
It'll come in on the 25th. I think some people have got this vision that there's going to be a whole load of drones landing on the 25th, scuttling into organisations and finding out they're non-compliant, and then the 26th all these fines will arrive. That is clearly not going to happen. It will be business as usual. I think we've also got to be minded that there's an awful lot within the Data Protection Act at the minute that is still in the GDPR. There's an awful lot that's good practice at the minute that's in the GDPR. So the new things that are out there are the minority. A lot of those new things, Article 29 haven't produced guidance on. ICO haven't produced guidance on. So I would think it would be highly unlikely that the ICO are going to find somebody about an issue they haven't even issued guidance about. So, you know, don't panic, I suppose, is my view, is make sure that what you're supposed to be doing at the minute in terms of your obligations are met, because that's where you'll be found wanting on the 25th or 26th of May if you've had a breach. And actually, it's nothing to do about the new regulation coming in. That's always been there since 1984 and 1998. Then clearly, you'd have been in breach of the old legislation, so you'll be in breach of the new.
So it's a case of don't panic, but at the same time, people can't do nothing.
No.
They've got to. What's the minimum that people should be? Where should people be as a minimum at the moment? Dawn?
Well, in my view, as a minimum, you should be meeting the obligations that you've been meant to meet since 1998 in the revised Data Protection Act. You should be meeting what has been good practice for nigh on 10 years with the ICO, things like privacy impact assessments, duty of transparency, the fair processing code of practice, the data sharing code of practice. All of those codes, if you're not meeting your obligations or following those, you need to be making sure that you're moving in the right direction to get those under your belt, and then look at what's new and what do I need to be doing. So it's an audit really of where are we now and where do we need to be and what's that plan that we're going to put in place. Because if the ICO come in and you've got a plan saying, we know that we're falling short on this, it was good practice, it's now mandatory, we've got a plan to make sure it's going to be in place, I'm sure you'd be better placed than if you've just not done anything.
Now, Darren, you were until recently Deputy Director at DFE. You were an information owner, I believe, there as well.
Information asset owner, yeah.
So, you know, what's your view about how prepared the central government is on this front?
Pretty good, actually, from my personal experience. It's something that I mean, it's April 2016 it was first announced. So yeah, Department for Education was certainly it's been working on this for well over 12 months in terms of trying to prepare itself for imminent GDPR. People tend to take care of data. They treat it, it is sacrosanct within central government. There are very tight controls around the information they have, often sometimes to the detriment of provision of public services, in my personal view, because people don't want to risk losing data, so they will hold on to it as opposed to using this as an opportunity to potentially share it. But it's certainly been there have been many meetings, many cups of tea and biscuits have been nibbled while talking about GDPR, and I think there have been some frustrations about there's not a single place to go to and say that's all we need to know. What is it we need to do? So do we need to put a tick box into our CRM system and everything will be fine? We'll be fine. It's not quite as straightforward as that, but there's certainly been clear progress in terms of looking at the data we hold. Do we still need to hold that data? So this is a real opportunity. If there's data that are held that are no longer needed and don't have any value, they can be destroyed. It's a great opportunity to kind of do that. So yes, central government has been aware of this for some period of time and been taking action.
And Gurpreet, what about in the NHS?
I think the same, really. I mean, there's established roles within each organisation around information governance. So those leads will have been aware of the guidance and knowing this is coming. So everyone's done a lot of work to try and kind of understand what the local impact of that is going to be on their organisation. I suppose what's been lacking is that level of detail in terms of how it needs to be managed and what our roles and responsibilities are around that. That's becoming clearer. But I think there's a lot of legwork happened and a lot of people talking to each other about what the implications of that is.
Thank you.
There's the fact that you've got to have a data protection officer if you're a public authority or if you're a certain size of organisation. And there's also new rights for individuals. The key to that is, though, that not all of those new things coming in will will be applicable to every organisation. So if you're not using consent, for instance, as a legal basis for processing, then a lot of those individual rights don't kick in. So for me, you've got a tension between, there's a whole load of stuff you're being told new, and you might be worrying about how am I going to do it, when in fact you might not need to worry about it because it might not be applicable. But equally, you've got a real now strong duty of transparency out to your public or your citizen or your client, which means you've got to be absolutely clear when you're telling people what you're doing with data and what you're not, and what their rights are. So you might have that tension between they've got a right under the GDPR, but because of the way you're legally processing, that right doesn't kick in, and that's quite a difficult
That's
message.
an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, because actually, Darren, you were at DFE. You've only recently moved over to TISCI, so you're familiar with the concept of the rights and the data protection. But it's an interesting one, because everybody is going on about consent and the dangers of consent around GDPR. But surely a lot of the work that in the NHS or central government that you're doing, it has a different basis for sharing?
Well, I mean, in terms of consent and sharing, as a public body, the Department for Education had a duty. It's accountable for the delivery of education services in England. So if everybody, said, I refuse to consent for you to use any data, we wouldn't know how many people were in schools, what children were doing, wouldn't be able to give any assurance to, citizens that actually education system was working, and wouldn't know how to fund it. There's a whole massive ramification around what consent actually people could or couldn't give for the data that are being held. I mean, I think it's. I'm sure there are bits that within every organisation, if that it'll hold data that they don't actually need, or they haven't got a genuine need to hold. So there will be some bits of data that I'm sure what this will do. And at the end of that, I think sometimes we forget this is about good practice. This is about protecting us as individuals and our data. Look at recent leakages which have made it into the media. So
Facebook, anybody?
Exactly. I'll be deleting my account as soon as we finish this. But actually, it's about It's about good practice. So, Dawn's mentioned it. A lot of the good practice stuff that I've been fortunate enough to work in organisations that have applied that. So I think the actual leap to implementation of GDPR will be relatively minor. If there are organisations which have never really looked at data for whatever reason, then I think it's going to be quite a challenge come 25th of May and moving onwards.
Gurpreet, I mean, you couldn't, the NHS couldn't run if it was, as Darren's just said about the DFE, you couldn't run if it was all around consent.
Absolutely.
So how are you approaching that? So which of the mechanisms of sharing can you use to deliver a public service?
So, I mean, there's a bit about implied consent, isn't there, in the NHS? I mean, most patients and people accessing services will assume that the NHS as an organisation shares its data, but what we have is boundaries across the NHS and health service. So certain parts of the service don't talk to each other, or they need that healthcare record to be shared. So that's where the focus really is around sharing of information, making sure that if patients are touching different parts of the NHS family, its services, then we're able to share that information meaningfully to different parts of the NHS. So that's a real constraint. A lot of patients assume because we're one NHS organisation, we just share data across each of the NHS. It doesn't always work that way. And that's the real challenge for the NHS to make sure it works in a seamless way.
Dawn?
I think there's a real challenge for the system, for the professionals, and for the communication to the public. Because in health and social care, the problem we've got is that we've got an interface between a data protection legislation and a common law duty of confidence. So often when we've asked for consent in the past, and when we will be doing it in the future, we are doing it to set aside the common law duty of confidence. We don't have to do it for the data protection legislation. We've got other legal ways in which we can process that data.
So what are those legal ways? Let's just pin this down. So obviously you can't be asking people in A&E for their consent to share their data.
There's different ways in which this works. So for 90%, probably more of the time, in terms of GDPR, once it comes in on the 25th of May, for sharing data, processing data in any way across health and social care, you would use the official vested authority that you've got in
Is that
you as a
item
public
5?
authority. That's Article 6,
Article 6.
E1. And then you would use medical purposes, which is very, very broad. It doesn't just cover direct care, it covers the efficiency and the effectiveness of the service, the lot. They are sound legal processes, conditions for processing under GDPR. You would not go anywhere near consent, and the ISO have made it clear you shouldn't. Because if you do, the barrier for consent is very, very high. So you're going to be grinding everything to a halt in order to do it, to make sure that you meet that threshold of consent. However, in health and social care, we generally put them into 2 boxes. There's very grey areas, but we generally put sharing into 2 boxes. Direct care, in which we say for common law duty of confidence, we use implied consent. We assume that the reasonable expectation of Helen is that if she goes to her GP and she needs referring to the trust, that data will be sent. So we set aside duty of confidence with your implied consent, a reasonable expectation, and we would use 6 and 9 in terms of our official capacity and the fact that we're using it for medical purposes, and that would be fine. When we're not using it for direct care, and remember there's a grey area about what falls into direct care and what doesn't, but generally when we're not using it for direct care, so if it was for effectiveness or efficiency of the service in some way, planning, etc., then we can't use implied consent for common law duty of confidence. So if we are saying that carries a duty of confidence, that data, and therefore the common law applies, we've got to set it aside in another way. And that is either in the public interest, through getting something called a Section 251, which is an application process to the Secretary of State, or more commonly, explicit consent. But the bar for explicit consent for common law remains as is. It's exactly the same as it's always been. Right. So the message to professionals is you don't need to worry about GDPR because you've got 6 and 9, don't go near consent. But if you are using data, sharing data, processing data that's carrying a duty of confidence and it's not for direct care, you still will get consent and you'll do it in exactly the same way as you've always done it. Nothing's changed.
Interesting. So how does that mirror what you're doing at the moment, Gurpreet?
Yes, very much so. So for services that are for direct care, the consent model is different. But if we're using it for services where, we're looking for contracting purposes or commissioning services or quality impact of services or looking at how services can be redesigned, that's the bit where the GDPR for us, for the NHS, will have more of an impact. How do we manage that consent process?
And what about the number? I mean, I've heard from an awful lot of suppliers that, like you say, the year 2000, it's going to be exactly the same. It's a bit of consent. So it's not all about consent in health and social care? Do you think that's the same in social care, that it moves?
Well, I think generally it's not all about consent as a whole. There's multiple layers about compliance with GDPR. If you look at, there's about awareness, there's about education. I mean, I think the vast majority of information breaches, certainly from my personal experience, has been as a result of kind of individual human error, someone accidentally emailing something out or losing something. So there's a whole raft of areas to look at. Saying please tick this box to say we can consent to use your data for these purposes, I just think is one of many aspects to look at.
Going back to the consent though, if you do go to the consent where you don't necessarily need it, if you're a public service, whether it's health or say local government, or central government, but what does that bring down that they might not needed to have brought down? Because that, as you say, that brings a load of rights to it that actually, might they just be complicating things?
They are complicating things, and that is why the ICO and the Health and Social Care Working Group have said don't go near consent unless you absolutely have to. If it's something that you absolutely cannot use another schedule condition of GDPR, do not go near consent. Because once you get into that consent realm, that bar is really high now for making sure that you as Helen know exactly what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, you're fully informed, you totally understand. You can withdraw that consent at any time. So you could come back in 2 days later and say, no, I've changed my mind. And you've got to start grabbing the data back in again. Your rights to portability don't kick in. Your rights to be forgotten doesn't kick in. Your rights to erasure don't kick in. So once you've used consent, you are opening yourself up to And it might be right and proper in some cases that you do, but it will be in the very exceptional minority cases you use consent for GDPR. You will still use consent for the common law duty of confidence when you're using data that is not for direct care purposes. But that's a different thing altogether. That's a different consent model. The bar's not as high. You just do what you've always done in either face-to-face, leaflet, tick a box. What people I think have got to be very, very careful that they don't confuse is opt-out with consent. They are two completely different things. So I don't always have to ask you. I do always have to tell you, unless it's in very exceptional circumstances. So even though I was using 6 and 9 for GDPR and I don't have to ask your consent, I still do have to have a duty of transparency. So I do have to tell you what I'm doing, I just don't have to ask you. In terms of consent and opt-out, I see a confusion all the time when I'm out of people saying, well, I asked them if they wanted to opt out or opt in, and that's consent. No, that's not consent at all. That's something completely different. And that's a preference and a choice. And it's not based in anything legal at all. It's a policy decision. I'm giving you the option of a preference.
Interesting. What about, sorry, you did mention, I'm going to push back on this because it's fascinating. With, you said that there are very few instances where consent within health and social care might be required. What are those ones? What are those use cases?
Mainly they'll be around research. Now there are other scheduled conditions you can use for research, so there's several different ways in which if you were doing research you would jump these different hurdles, and my advice for that would be to go to the Health Research Authority website and go to their guidance, or IGA. They've got a link through to their guidance. They've done some really detailed guidance on research, and if you're doing big cohorts for certain things where you're going to use anonymised data or pseudonymised data, and where you're going to use personal data, and which conditions for processing you would use, and where you would actually need to use consent for GDPR as well as for common law duty of confidence. But they're very exceptional circumstances. I don't know the business well enough as an IG professional, and I actually don't think most IG professionals do, to say these are the sorts of circumstances, but I think as professionals, clinicians may look at it and go, I think I couldn't use that and that. They would have to be explored because there is this confusion about what am I doing for common law and what am I doing for GDPR. And often professionals will go, I absolutely need consent because they know they need it for confidentiality. So they're stuck in that, I've got to have it because I've got to have it because it's confidential data. Yeah, you do, but you don't need it for this. You can use 6 and 9.
Interesting around health and social care then. So you're saying that essentially for sharing between, say, local government and the NHS around social care, they don't need to get the consent of the patient?
No, the interpretation of Article 9, medical purposes, now pulls in quite a lot of social care. So professionals that are in social care who've got a duty of confidence also fall in, like health professionals have always done under DPA. Under DPA, the dividing line was quite grey about whether social workers and people like that fell in. Under GDPR, they definitely do. So that's not a problem. Where it does become a bit of a problem in integration is where we're not just doing sharing across health and social care, but we're doing sharing across education, fire service, voluntary sector. We're pulling in all of those different sharing abilities. Then which legal basis you use and whether people have got a legal right to have that data kicks in.
Darren, what would your view be on that from, say, the education point of view? Would that be the same approach? You wouldn't be looking for consent there, you'd be doing it in terms of a legal basis for existing. What about the Digital Economy Act, actually? That brings me to that, because that does have a presumption of sharing, doesn't it?
Well, if I look at this from a user, a citizen perspective, I want my government services to be joined up. I want, as a parent of 3 children, I want to know when I take my daughter to hospital that they understand her medical history, if engaged with local services, social care services. I expect it to work. So actually, there's a presumption for me that there is data sharing going on. The issue I would have as a parent is about loss of data. It's not about sharing of data, but in terms of the approach we had at the Department for Education. So quite a few of the services, things like 30-hour childcare, would pull data from HMRC. There would be data from education, DWP. So actually, creating that legal basis for sharing data within organisations where there's a genuine need to do so, and ensuring there is appropriate legislation in place for that to happen. I mean, that's the expectation, I think, from again, for me as assistant, is that needs to happen for services to work. We can't operate as siloed bits of government. And actually, it's great to hear you talking about actually you're saying your expertise is in things like information governance, because that's exactly one of the really big changes I've seen in the last kind of 4 or 5 years or so within government, is different bits, professionalisms and specialities coming together, so helping clinicians and practitioners with experts in technology, information governance, data security, protection, etc., all coming together to actually provide better quality, more secure services from government.
Gurpreet.
Yeah, absolutely. Same principle, really. I think there's an assumption that the data should be shared for the benefit of the user. So that's the perception the end user has. The confusing bit is the awareness bit. You just hear lots of policy and you hear lots of guidance coming out, and when you talk to different people you get different messages. So I think it's really important. I know the guidance is coming out, but it can be a little bit vague and can be a little bit open to interpretation. So I think that's where we really need to focus in on and make it really clear for our users when they access services, then what bits of data is shared and what bits aren't shared. And actually, if you're not happy with elements of your records being shared, how do you opt out? I think that's the bit we really need to put a lot of emphasis on, really.
I mean, I think government has a really good record. Yeah, it's got actually a very good reputation for data and use of it. I mean, I've worked with people who are so fastidious about data protection, they won't even share it with people they're sat next to because there's a risk that it might be lost. And often, sometimes you have to force data out of people's, cold hands to say, well, actually, there's a real need to share that data in order to improve that quality of service. So actually, my personal experience has been people working with it have treated it, dare I say, potentially more carefully than what they would do with some of the public finances that they might be accountable for as well. I mean, how dare I say that? but actually, people take that stuff very, very, very seriously within central government, and I'm pretty certain it's actually the same within the health sector as well.
Do you think, though, on that basis, that the number of times I get told, we can't share data, we can't do this, and I have a child who has disabilities, and the number of times I want different hospital trusts to share his info, no, we can't email them that, we can't send them that. Do people hide behind it? Dawn, you're looking as though you're nodding there.
Yeah, people do hide behind it, and I have a grave concern that I think as an IG professional, I'm not sure out in the system, actually right across the sectors, but particularly from my view in health and social care, that we are training people properly to approach what we're asking them to do now. So a lot of our IG staff that we've got out in the system were recruited for their skills in IT and IG in terms of filling in the IG toolkit, making sure the organisation knew what they were supposed to be doing, answering subject access requests, and particularly keeping the organisation compliant. So locking everything down.
Yeah.
What we're into is a coin that's protect everything, but let's have data sharing that's safe and secure and sensible. And the skills around the interpretation and application of how you get that to happen whilst remaining safe, secure and sensible is quite a tricky thing to pull off, and I'm not sure that we're exposing people to the fact that A, that's the thought process that needs to go into it, and B, the knowledge and experience you need to pull on from various places to enable you to be able to do that and enable your organisation to do that.
And I think that is one of the key challenges I think we've got here, is that IG people generally tend to be very risk averse. Yeah. So the concern is, as you have more guidance coming out, less information, less transparency about how things are meant to work, things will just get locked down rather than being open. So we don't get into this environment. That's the key challenge again for us, is not to be able to share data for the benefit of the end user, and not get into a position where, because we're not sure, it's just a no, and it's don't share.
there are huge benefits to sharing data with the advances in AI and machine learning and big data analytics. The opportunity to improve care is enormous. But do you think that there are people using that as a kind of computer says no, using data protection as a let's not continue this? Darren?
Yeah, almost certainly. I mean, and I think sometimes it comes down to kind of personal beliefs often, actually. So if you're I've been an information asset owner within central government, so there are risks and penalties associated with that if you don't treat data. So, there is, you're almost incentivised sometimes to say, well, actually, just let's not do anything with that data. Let's just keep hold of it, because actually, if I lose it, that's my job. That's a large fine. That's potential imprisonment. I'm looking out for that. So, I think sometimes we don't make it that easy to take that kind of risk versus reward decision, I'd say.
Yeah, I do worry. I suppose I spent the 15 years at the ICO of my life constantly saying to people, there's nothing in that Data Protection Act stops you from sharing data. That act was purely set up through the European directive actually to be able to share data. It was put in place so that there would be an environment and market where data could be shared, but it was recognised that by sharing it, we needed to put some controls around it. So it's just about controls around it and safeguards. It's not about not doing it. My concern is that I felt we were starting as a profession to make inroads into that, of saying, no, sharing's good. Not all sharing's bad. You just need to be safe, secure and sensible. We've got a new legislation coming in, and I'm really worried that a lot of firms out there selling training and everything else are pushing it as this, everything's new, there's differences, there's this, it's more stringent, it's this, it's that, the fines are much bigger. And I'm worried that we're going to start going back down into a bunker of risk adverse, of, let's just not do anything, and we'll just end up in paralysis. So I'm really keen that we kind of don't allow ourselves to go back into information governance as a black art, because we've suddenly got a new piece of legislation.
On that whole legislation piece, obviously over the last 6 months, the number of questions that we've had over GDPR, what does it mean, when is the guidance coming out? But also it does seem to be a new vocabulary that people are, struggling with. So questions I get asked around, what do some of these things mean in practice? What is privacy by design? What's the culture of privacy? What does the transparency, what do I need to do for that? Where are some privacy by design? What does that mean?
Well, but if I look at it from a kind of technology perspective, that's about making sure you look at aspects around security and access when you're designing your services. So people are very good to come up with policy ideas about how we're going to do something, but actually it's about bringing the right experts in, like some of the panel members here, to say, well, actually, when we're designing a service, what are the things we really need to consider? If you look at things like the Internet of Things and the kind of connectivity, etc., of devices, they're almost certainly collecting personal data in there. So if you're building services which rely on those, how, just asking you the same question at regular intervals within the kind of projects and that work you're doing, is it secure? What data are we holding on people? Do we have a genuine need for it? I think we're talking an awful lot about data sharing here, but actually a lot of it comes back to data collection. Why have we actually got a genuine need to collect data? Government's great at going, we'll collect that because we might need that. A minister, I've had this question many times, a minister might ask us that in 2 years.
Yeah.
Well, if the minister knew that it was potentially kind of on the bounds of legality whether or not we did or didn't collect it, then we might err on the side of caution with that. So for me, it's about having an approach which is, rigorous and thorough and considerate of the individual subjects for whom you're going to be collecting data about. It's not about locking things down so they don't add any value.
For me, it's about building it into business process. So you wouldn't set out, certainly in health and social care, without doing a project initiation document. And as part of that document, you would have to say what your business case is, what the finance is, what the resource is going to be, what the benefits are. It should be as part of that, and what's the privacy impact. So for starters, my real push with this is part of that privacy by design is not just bringing in IG, it's bringing in your comms professionals. Because a big bit of that is going to be, how are we going to tell people that we're doing this. Because if you actually sit down, and going back to your point, if you sit down and say, actually, if I sat somebody down and I told them, this is what this is all about, this is the data we're going to use, and this is what we're going to use it for, would they be comfortable with it? Or would they say, why do you need to know my name and address if you're only doing that? Of what relevance is that data? Then that rings you an alarm bell that actually I'm collecting too much here. I don't need to collect all this. Plus, for us as IG professionals, we're always an afterthought. So generally, particularly in health and social care, my experience in the last 2 years has been we don't get brought in until the national project or initiative gets rolled out regionally or locally, and then someone like Capri will come back in nationally and say to me, can we do this? And we'll go, do what? Do this? Why are you doing that? Well, because this national project is telling us we've got to do it. And then suddenly we're going, whoa, stop. And we're seen as the barrier then, because we're suddenly putting the brakes on. And it's not we're putting the brakes on, you absolutely can't do it. It's we're putting the brakes on because you need to think this through before you do what you're going to do. So if we'd fed that right back in at the top, right at project initiation, we'd have had all that battened out. And then when we do put it into the system, it's not about everybody having to work out themselves. Well, how are we going to do that? And can we do it? That'll have already been done.
And we as a system, we tend to focus in on system IT systems and processes quite quickly, and we jump ahead of ourselves a little bit, and we don't think through the implications of sharing data. What are the benefits of those not sharing and sharing data. So I think that element is really important. The IG folk in those projects have to be involved day one to help design the system, because if you can't share elements that you think will give you the benefit, then you've got systems that you can't actually use properly. And I think that's a really important point that you've made.
So the culture really needs to change as to how we approach projects and how we bring in the IG professionals at the beginning.
Yeah. And the comms professionals to make sure that duty of transparency is fulfilled right from the word go. That arguably you might want to tell people what you're thinking of doing. And get their views.
But of course, when they brought the comms people into, say, the care.data,
too late though.
They also went down the wrong track. They didn't get something that resonated with the public, unfortunately, on that one. But it's interesting to talk about comms, because how important is the internal comms as well as to making, how do you make sure that the people on the front line are handling the data? You talked about breaches earlier, Darren. How do we stop that? Because that's a big part of the GDPR, isn't it? The fines for data breaches are eye-watering. So how do you handle that? So,
again, any programme of work that you kick off around sharing of large-scale data needs to be led by frontline clinicians. So we always try and have clinicians lead our programmes of work. So the clinicians are brought in at the stage where they design the system and the programme of work, because ultimately they're the end users of the data. If they don't want the data or don't need the data, they're not brought in. But actually, if they've developed a system and they can't get access to the data they need, or the sharing arrangements aren't in place, then end users won't use the system. So we've got this real trade-off between implementing systems and getting the systems, talking to each other, but also the clinicians are the key users of the systems. So we always try and promote, when we run large-scale programs of work, that the clinicians are at the forefront of that piece of work.
Darren, from your point in the DFE again, where how does that impact? Because there's so many people must be able to access that information. How do you instill in them something that they kind of might not really understand?
Well, when I left the DFE, there were about 5,500 staff that were there. So every member of staff was required to do annual information security e-learning. So civil service learning's got a whole raft of information that's on there. And if you're an information asset owner or a programme SRO, there were various different levels of kind of training you needed to do in order to demonstrate your ability to kind of fulfil your role. So every member of staff had to do that on an annual basis. Now, that's not a 100% guarantee that people aren't going to breach data, but it does point out some of the key things around leaving bits of paper on the I'm sure we've all seen it in offices, various personal sensitive data left on a piece of paper on a desk somewhere. So there were other bits that DfE did around rolling out new and implementing new technology, which meant that people didn't need to print as much stuff off. So actually it kind of helps in that approach as well. And then so looking from a TISCI perspective, what we've now done is all members of staff are undertaking e-learning specifically around GDPR. So it takes the information security learning a little bit further, just so people are aware, because if we as an organisation are accessing personal data on behalf of our clients, we need to know how to treat it. So a lot of it comes down to education. That's no cast iron guarantee, but at least you can say you've made people aware, and you've given them some opportunity of the steps they need to take should they encounter personal data and what they need to do with it.
I mean, in the NHS though, I mean, there's I don't know whether it's the same in your CSU in your area, but there seems to be, certainly in my experience, an enormous amount of attachment to the fax machine. And I don't get how that can be, so as someone who's always worked in the technology industry, I just see kind of audit trails and being able to monitor things as a, email or whatever, a much secure way of doing things rather than leaving bits of paper, as you just mentioned, lying around. How prevalent is that kind of cultural shift away from, no, we fax it because it's the way we should?
I mean, the NHS has been renowned for pushing paper around the system and losing paper in that process. So, but there's been a huge shift around the paperless agenda in the NHS to not do that. And we're finding more and more services are running now without the use of paper. Uses of systems or email, other electronic mechanisms for transfer of data are now in place to get to help the information flow across the NHS system. So there is a massive shift. I mean, there is some parts of the NHS still reliant on paper, and you still walk through some wards in hospitals where they're reliant on paper, or you still see some GP practice systems where you walk in and they're still using the old paper systems. But that's very few and far between nowadays in the NHS.
So, and how do we get those laggards into the electronic age? I mean, is GDPR, is the data protection and the oomph of all of this, is that kind of a push maybe to get rid of that paper?
I think it might be another lever at senior levels about maybe resources that are required to do that educational push, or to get the systems and processes in place that can take out the paper. I mean, I know when I was in the ICO, I used to be saying, why are people still faxing information? And a lot of it was around, well, we don't think the email's secure because we're not on the N3 connection. And so rather than do that, and we don't think that's secure, we feel happier sending it by fax and then ringing and saying, have you got it? So, there are some things there that it might help with in terms of raising the profile. But the education for me, it's really important that we carry on with the kind of what I call the first rung on the ladder, that everybody through the door gets IG training as a matter of mandate, and that's done every 12 months, so it's in people's psyche. But really and truthfully, I think the easiest way of educating people about IG in your own workplace and how you deal with it is breaches that come along from other things that you see on the news. So it starts to bring it into everyone's awareness that, actually personal data is something that's really important, and it's really important to the business and to reputational risk as well as to money. And actually, I deal with personal data. What would I do if I'd faxed that to the wrong person? Or I think there's an educational push there, because it's very similar to health and safety. Most people won't go on a huge amount of health and safety training. They'll probably do a little bit of a sheep dip every year. But they all know, we would have known, if we'd come in here and one of your camera cables had been right across that door, we probably would have all been saying, be careful you don't fall over that.
Yes. Thankfully, there are no safety things in our studio. Yeah. We're perfect. Yeah. But actually, you bring on to an important point, which is actually I wanted to kind of move the topic over to subject access requests and the citizen's right to ask for their information and their data. And also the fact that they possibly don't understand the difference between consent and the legal rights for sharing data. And the ICO is about to be starting some awareness campaigns, so there's going to be a mass awareness of people, I've got rights, I need to have my information, I can tell you not to use my information. Do you think that's going to have possibly an adverse effect? Are people going to be going, I want to see all my data, and no, you can't, and you might spend a lot of time going, yes, we can. What do you think on that? Especially bearing in mind that Facebook, the breaches that have just come out of there, it is becoming, it's on the national news, data and how people use their data. Thoughts, Darren?
I'm not sure we're going to see a massive increase in subject access requests, is my personal view. I think if people had issues with data, today, they would deal with them today. They're not going to wait for the 25th of May and then say... Well,
but they might not know about them today, I think, is what I'm trying to say here, that with the awareness campaigns haven't started. People assume that the public sector knows who you are and that it's one public sector. Of course, we know it isn't.
Yeah.
But when there's a lot of campaigns that have been going, you've got rights, they can't use your data without asking you. You don't think that's going to have any increase?
Marginally. I genuinely don't think there's going to be this bow wave of millions of requests coming into various public bodies. I genuinely hope not, anyway, because actually I think there's probably far better ways of spending public funds than responding to a lot of access requests from people. But I mean, that's just I just don't think they will. I mean, I could be totally wrong. I've been totally wrong before on many things.
No, I agree. I don't think there'll be a huge wave of requests coming in, but I think there will be some for us to manage, and those will be some people that are just interested to see what information is being held about me on those systems, because it's the first opportunity they've ever had to have to look through that or read through that, if you like. So I think there will be some requests like that of interested citizens and users about what information is being held, but I don't think it's going to be millions of requests coming through in the first week.
How are you planning to handle those requests?
So this is where different organisations have got different approaches, and it's, again, we as a CSU, we can provide guidance to our users, our customers about how they manage some of this, but ultimately it's down to them and their local processes. So what we're encouraging all our users to do is have systems in place where they can track the requests coming in and how quickly they're responding to those requests and what information is being asked for. So we can start to monitor the trends and the compliance against people responding, our users responding back to the citizens. And it's also so from a CSU point of view, it's about systems, processes, and guidance. How that's being implemented on the ground is very much down to local organisations and how they want to manage it, really. So.
I think there's two issues with this. I personally don't think there'll be a whole raft of subject access requests comes in. I mean, I bear the scars of being there right at the beginning of Freedom of Information Act and going round doing lots of conferences with people screaming at me that this was going to be horrendous because they would get so many requests that they would just be brought to a grinding halt. Now, there was a peak when it first came in. That tended to be from journalists about official information. It didn't tend to be from people, individuals wanting information. So under the FOIA Act at the minute, they can do that as well as subject access requests. They can send and say, I want all this data, and part of that might be their own data. So that's already been there. I think, yes, the ICO are doing a campaign. Thank the Lord, it's taken a long, long time. That they have got a statutory duty to make sure the public understand what their rights are. So it's right and proper that they're doing that. I think that's down to them getting that message right, that these are what your rights are. This is why these rights have been put in place. The intention behind these rights is for these sorts of things. And they won't kick in when you've got X, Y, and Z. That's the danger for me, that if it does go out of, you've got these rights, and you've always got a right to data portability, you've always got a right to be forgotten, you've always got a right to erasure, that is going to cause a problem because you don't always have that right. You have it in certain circumstances. Now, I can't believe that the ICO are not going to do that. They will. Their comms department is very, very good. It will be couched in you'll have these in these sorts of circumstances. So it doesn't, though, affect two rights, which... One's subject access, which of course we now can't charge for after the 25th of May, and there's a tighter time scale on it. So it is very reliant on people being able to access that data quickly and efficiently and get it back to that person in a reduced time scale. Plus, if anybody's building their business plans on subject access request fees, rethink now, because you won't be getting that money through the door.
You can't charge them anymore. But of course, in the NHS, they have charged for your medical records.
Under the access to health records, but there is some debate about that and how that policy has been implemented and can be implemented in the future. So I would, if I were you, I would basically assume you cannot charge for the time being. The right that I think we may get very much more requests for, given that there is an awareness campaign about new rights, and it kind of interfaces with the new national data opt-out, is the right to object. So at the moment we've got the Data Protection Act Section 10, which allows you to write to an organisation and say, I want you to stop processing my data. But at the moment under that, it's relatively weak as an organisation. Unless it's something that's causing you real substantial harm, they don't have to stop processing it. They can just basically say to you, no, I'm sorry, we've got a legitimate reason for doing this and we're going to continue to do it. Under the right to object, it's much, much stronger. So you're going to have a really good reason why you're going to continue to process that data. Now, clearly, if it's for direct care, you're going to have quite a strong premise there of saying, well, we can't provide you the care if we don't. That's up to you, but we can't provide you the care. But when we're out of those boundaries, if people issue a written right to object, those are going to have to be very carefully thought through, and the response has to be quite specific. So, given that we're launching opt-out at the same point as GDPR's coming in, if people then say, well, I'm only allowed to opt out of things that are not my direct care and that are not anonymised in line with the ICO code of anonymisation, actually I want to stop more than that. They've still got that right to object, and they can contact the organisation and say, no, I want you to stop processing my data.
How does that impact you, Gurpreet? I mean, you know, would the organisation, how would you handle that? Somebody saying, I don't want you to process my data. Actually, we've got a right to. That's quite...
Well, it goes back to the communication, doesn't it, and the awareness. How robust is that? What is it telling citizens and users what they can opt out of, what they can't? So that's really important, the messages out there, because if that's not clear...
Yeah.
You know, the organisations will get all sorts of requests, and actually they won't know themselves how to deal with, you know, the certain requests. So the awareness has got to be right. But also once, you know, with any system, you know, once you go live with a new, you know, process or request access coming into the organisation, you get into you know, you start to know, yes, absolutely, that's a legitimate request, and we need to go back and talk that through and sit down with the services to agree, you know, whether we need to redesign or stop sharing that data, or whether that's simply a request that the patient's misunderstood what their rights are, and we just need to have a communication that goes back out. So the awareness campaign is so important to this, because it's not only going to inform the kind of, you know, the public, but it's also going to inform the service users as well in terms of what they can and can't be sharing.
I'm just aware of time, and actually I can't get any questions through, so I'm sorry if I've not picked up on any of your questions in the last few minutes. Just two questions on this. Are you going to need systems to, you know, do you really need a system to log all of this under transparency, to log all the subject access requests, like freedom of information systems, etc.? And secondly, how far do you have to collate the information around the individual? You know, so if somebody says, I want the information, do they mean the information when they come to one of your CCGs and say, I want the information, I want everything that every NHS body holds on me? Or, you know, how far, what's the scope of this, and how do you pull that all together? How do you collate it?
In some parts of the NHS that doesn't exist, so you're not able to make one request in and get all the information that's held on all NHS systems. So it's organisational based at this stage. So that's my view. So if you can go to a CCG and say, what information do you hold on me within your organisation, and actually the CCG will not hold any data on the patient. It will be the practices within that CCG. So you'd have to go to the GP and say what information is held, and the GP can provide you with the information they hold on their systems. So, but if you wanted to go to your acute organisation to say what information do you hold, it's generally another request, is my view.
Yeah.
And how about at the DFE? I mean, it's a huge organisation, huge databases. If you have information about one person, how quickly would it have been easy to find everything across the organisation in one?
I'd say it's much easier now than it would have been 5 or 6 years ago. So
what's the difference? Technology?
Yes.
So advances in technology?
Yeah, well, part of that, and also changing in ways of working and thinking. So if your organisation is very siloed and runs as lots of different units with its own data stores, it's going to be far harder to facilitate responding to subject access requests than if you use technology to pull together. Systems like CRM systems are actually very good ways of managing customer interaction. So if someone were to contact a DFE around a particular academy school and what information is held about a previous head teacher, they may want it destroyed for any reason, that would now be much easier than it would have been several years ago, because they've rationalised the number of applications and information they've got. So that's partly technology improvement, but also business process changes and people thinking differently and being much more user-centric about the way they build and actually run services. Again, thinking it from a kind of an individual perspective, if I were to contact an organisation, my expectation would be that they'd be able to respond to that very quickly. Now, one thing that GDPR will do is reduce the time scale from 40 to 20 days, so it makes it much more time critical for organisations, if we're talking about health sector here, to be able to respond to that. And if the information isn't there, those 20 days need to be identifying the source of information and providing a response, as opposed to sat in someone's inbox waiting to do something. So something which I would say logs the fact it's come in, gives regular updates to people asking, so they know where they are, and also provides collating a response. So 20 days becomes much more time critical, because if people can't respond to those, and because I'm a bit sad, I was reading about freedom of information requests. Someone logged an FOI request about responding to subject access requests. And the response was, I'm sorry, it's going to take us too much time to pull together this information, so we're not going to respond. And there were quite a few in that ilk. So I would have a few questions personally if an organisation couldn't tell you how many subject access requests they'd had, because it took them too long to pull together the information, about their ability to be able to respond to a subject access request.
So do people need to get new, I mean, you mentioned CRMs. Do people need to get a new system, or if they have a CRM, could they log it all in that? Could it just be done as another part of that? Or are they going to need separate systems or new systems to log everything, respond to everything?
So I think the key is you've got to have some kind of systematic approach to managing and tracking some of this. So whether you do that, you've got a system, and that's a spreadsheet type system, but the one that's shared across the organisation, so other people can see that. If it works for you, it's fine. If it doesn't work for you, and you want more data to come out of that, you want to be able to do some more analytics around how quickly we were able to respond to some of the requests, what the difficulties were with that, where the information sources came from. If you want to log that and track that so that you can improve the efficiency of those requests in the future, then you're going to need a system that's going to give you that information, if you like. So in the CSU, we've got a number of options we can provide our clients with that can help track some of that, and some of those are systems and some of those are around processes.
I think where the difficulty will be in this space, because as both of you have already said, at the minute it's organisational. So you go to a data controller and you ask them what they hold on you. Now we've always said in the past, and this certainly came out with ICO when we were going through troubled families initiatives and all of those sorts of things, good practice is that one person answers all those requests, that you're not sending an individual around 26, 32 different organisations that are working on one project to find out what they've got on you. I see when we're working integrated care systems that there needs to be a lead person, be that the DPO or the data protection officer, or be it someone else within that project group. One organisation needs to take the lead on, when we get subject access requests, this is how we're going to deal with them. And we're going to collate them all, and then we're going to send them. Because otherwise we'll get into integrated care systems all the way geographically, and then people putting subject access requests in and having to bounce around 40 odd different organisations. You're not going to get that back in 20 days.
Well, I mean, someone's just put in the question, Al has said what's the interpretation of the 1 month deadline? Is that 30 days or 31 days or a calendar month or 28 days in the case of February? That's a bit vague.
I'm not sure that the ICO have put out guidance about that yet. That might be an Article 29 working party issue. Generally, when things like FOIA have come out and they've said a month, they mean 28 calendar days or 20 working days. So
right.
It'll be
so we'll get more guidance on that.
Yeah.
There's also another one which is from Mark, who's just asking, how many organisations do you think have actually got systems in place to do this, and how many organisations are going to have to start looking for systems to do this?
So there's no legal requirement for you to track all your subject access requests and tell people how many you've got and what timescales, and there's no legal requirement to do that. But it's like you guys have said, it would seem sensible to do that, because you're going to want to know, am I hitting that deadline? And if you do get the ICO in saying, actually, we think you've taken too long to answer this, if you can say, well, actually, we had an influx at that particular point, there'd been something on Facebook that had said X was dealing with it, and we also were dealing with that company, so we had, 2,000 more than we normally get, and we didn't answer 2 of them, but you can see that we've answered all the rest. It kind of helps your case, rather than, oh, did we? We don't know. We got a lot in, but we're not really sure how many we answered or how many we didn't.
So the advice would be to track it.
So the advice
carefully.
is if you can track it, but it's not about going out and spending £2 million on a tracking system for a subject access request. It's about using what you've already got. I think that you can tailor to doing that.
So if you have a CRM in place, you could quite easily put those processes in. As you were saying about the DFE.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's quite similar to kind of case management, isn't it? In a way, someone asks a question, it goes to someone for a response, you provide a response, they go away happy, or they come back and say, I'd like something else. So, technology can be relatively simple, doesn't need to be... I'd like to think we aren't spending £2 million on...
No. I'd like to think that every organisation is actually tracking if they get a subject access request and what's going out, be that just in an Excel spreadsheet or on a piece of paper. I would have thought some people would be tracking it, but then there might be organisations where the thing for me is when you've got subject access requests is that they're coming to the same point. So wherever they go into an organisation, they're being managed centrally in terms of this is what we need from all of you guys and this is what we've put out. Because if you get it going into a big organisation and then all the different departments are answering all the different subject access requests, then you will not have a handle on what's coming in and going out.
There's something about consistency, isn't there? About if you get the same request multiple times as an organisation, you're responding in the same in a common way, not different ways each time.
We're very close on time. I know that we're running out of time, and so I just wanted to throw this one into the mix for sort of final comments from you guys. So technology is not standing still. We're finding new things that we can do with data and AI, etc. So, I'm thinking of IoT, telehealth, telecare, and circles of family around and friends around the patient or the elderly person, vulnerable person, robotic process automation, all of these new advances. So my final question is GDPR a block or a driver for innovation? Thoughts? And I'm going to come to Dawn first, and then I'm going to come around to you guys.
Well, I would say it was a driver, wouldn't I? Because that's that's the side of the coin I sit on. Yeah, I think it is a driver for innovation because I think it resets the clock. So it says, okay, so we've had all this, it's a barrier, it's a this, it's a that, it's a black art, we've got to reset the clock to know this is moving us and driving us forward into an age of innovation and using technology and being paperless and doing all of those things, but still remaining compliant. And it's about telling people what we're doing and what things are in place. So for me, it's about education and transparency again. I think we bandy these words around like telecare and AI, and I'm not sure we know what they mean. Certainly, I think there's people in the profession don't know what they mean, and the public sure as hell don't know. Majority of people do not know what that means at all. I think the biggest challenge we've got in that area of innovation is clearly there are lots of players in it, and they can be big players or they can be one man and a dog in a garage. And it's making sure that whether they're a very, very small innovation company that are coming to us with a product or a big organisation that's selling a product, that they understand the privacy implications and how we need to deal with those to make it safe, sensible and secure. So that's my view.
Gurpreet.
It needs to be a driver, doesn't it? Absolutely. And the risk with something like this is it becomes something that's a blocker people can hide behind. So we need to absolutely make sure that the guidance coming out from the centre is being interpreted in the right way by local organisations. We've got a consistency in terms of the way we all see that guidance coming out, and we implement it and deploy it in the right way. And the systems bit's just meant to make it easier. So if you've got systems in place, it makes your life easier. But we just need to make sure that the guidance is telling us the right information.
Darren.
Sorry to be boring. I'll agree.
You'll agree too.
I see it very much as an enabler. I mean, if we implement this, it forces organisations like ourselves to think much more about the user and what we're doing with their data. We build in privacy and security right early on when we're building services, and then that raises trust. And then when people have trust in public services using their data, I think that's when we can genuinely take a leap forward into providing even better service.
Trust is an interesting one. Just one last question on this, and I know they're going to be cross with me because they're going to cut me off any second. Is after the Facebook Cambridge Analytica news story that's burst on the scene this week, do you think that's going to damage public trust in how we hold data?
I can't see it as being a positive. I can't see to kind of flip that question round. Will it damage trust? Will it force me to do anything different with my Facebook account? Probably not.
No.
But I don't know. Will people
do you think it'll public
services?
perception? What do you think?
I suppose having worked in news for many years before I went to the ICO, I'd say no news is bad news. So
it raises the awareness.
It raises
Yes.
the profile. So for me, yes, there is a downside that it could start people thinking, oh, I'm not giving my data to anyone. But actually, for health, is that ever going to happen? Because you want to give your data because you want your direct care. Yeah.
You want care. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Dawn Monaghan, Gurpreet Deb, and Darren Bassett. Thank you for joining me for a fantastic conversation on GDPR and subject access requests. This afternoon we'll be back talking about cloud and breaking away from legacy systems and migrating to the cloud. And hopefully you could also join us on the 19th of April, where we'll be talking about digitising policing. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.